Hi, my name is Sean Roberts. I work at Yahoo. I'm also on the OpenStack board. So this talk is about starting to socialize the redefinition of the trademark policy in Roughstack. There's been it's been rather liberal in the past, and we're not looking to actually change it too much, but we're actually looking to develop this set of principles, socialize the principles and the process behind coming up with these, and then developing a series of tests that would allow us to define the trademark by those tests. So what we're getting very close to now is actually saying which capabilities of OpenStack we'd like to test against and how those tests would likely be run. Rob Hirschfeld and Toman are also on the board, and they're joining us remotely tonight. They've been working. I've been a little bit more in the background, but they've been working a lot more, so I'll let them do most of the talking about it. So what we did here is, let's see if we can add anybody to get good. Hopefully that's a little blurry. Yeah, a little blurry. Hey, there we go. My contacts are very cool. We just created this. We have a whole bunch of Etherpads on as we make progress. Actually, if you want to look at Rob Hirschfeld's blog, there's a ton of information that he's been blogging since last year on progress. It's good to see the historical. I've blogged a little bit about it. He's blogged a little bit about it. But that's kind of a little bit of background. Rob's going to talk about what we're socializing as far as implementing for the ideas that we have about implementing changes to the trademark policy. So, Rob, take it away.
Oh, boy, that's a setup for me. Hey, everybody, and thank you for participating. I'm going to happily make sure you guys know that you're guinea pigs, because this is a concept that we've been spending a lot of time on at the board level and with the technical committee, but it's one that not very many people follow closely, and we want to make sure that we can explain what's important. And so we're asking for your help to sort of help sift through, everything that we're presenting. It's tons of information, so that we can explain this to the community in a way that they understand why it's important and how they can contribute. So with that, and I don't have a sense for how much people know or don't know. I can give you the 5-minute overview. Do you have the principles up?
I do.
John? Okay. Phew. I'm going to start a little bit backwards for this. It's really important to understand that this process has been going on a long time, and every time we've tried to rush it or make it answer too many big questions, we've always run aground. And so what we did very intentionally was we stepped backwards to sort of first principles and smaller bites. And a lot of what we're doing is working out stepwise what we can agree to, what the community is ready for, and then move it forwards. It's one of those classic, the faster we push the process, the longer it takes. So we're very careful about the pace. And we're actually just at some really critical milestones. So what we started with was this 10 principles, which are really a flowchart that Sean has up in front of you. And it starts on the top with these general statements about what core is and what we're trying to achieve. And what we're really trying to do is we're trying to define a definition of OpenStack core that applies to commercial use. So when somebody is selling a product that says, I am OpenStack, we need to be able to tell them, yes, you can say that. We're not trying to control whether or not somebody says, I'm OpenStack Nova. That's OpenStack code. People can do that. It's when it becomes a commercial prospect that it gets much stickier and the OpenStack brand becomes much more important. And so what we wanted to do initially was to say, we want an OpenStack brand that applies to every use. We decided not to take on the idea that there might be a private cloud mark or a public cloud mark or a animals use only mark. I don't know. And so we're trying to create a definition of OpenStack that is universal. And so the first couple principles apply to that. And there's text that backs this document. There's a whole page on the OpenStack wiki that describes what these principles are in detail, and sometimes we go way down in the weeds and talk about specific items very productively. And then, so the next section of this talks about the code itself and what code is included or not. And there's been a lot of talk about this section called what's in there. It's called designated sections. So the idea here is that OpenStack is Apache licensed. You can do pretty much whatever you want with that code. You can't necessarily, if you copy it, you can't necessarily say it's OpenStack. And one of the things that the community felt was very important was that if you're going to say you're using OpenStack, you must be using certain parts of the code. And so that's what those sections say. But because we want to be vendor and ecosystem friendly, it doesn't make sense to use all of the code. There's places that we know are for plugins or extensions or changes or places where somebody has an enhancement. And we want to say there's parts that you can change and there's parts that you can't. And a big part of that is because we want to encourage upstreaming as a core value in OpenStack.
Can I
of course, you there? Please.
Any questions? So this is the section that's people have had the most discussion about and the most questions about why we're doing it this way. Do you guys have any questions before we move on? Anybody, or like why we're designating bits of code need to be in there and why we're not just supporting APIs, pure APIs?
Sure. Why?
Wasn't meant to be a softball here, but thank you. Part of the reason is that we don't want OpenStack to become a shell, and some companies just start developing against the APIs as they exist today and not contribute back to the basic code that's out there that actually makes OpenStack community. So, not that I think anybody has an intention, but that we're concerned that it could lead to that. Anything to add to that, Rob?
It's actually one of the topic areas where if we need to dig into it, it's one of those things that we have on the list as a complex topic. And it's one where the TC is very actively engaged because we actually have a request. The TC actually defines what is designated sections. And actually there's a question, there's a topic. So on the Etherpad, which I don't think is up, we went through, okay. So in this areas to explain, it's one of the areas that we want to help figure out how much time we should spend on it or not. This is part of the guinea pig aspect of this meeting. If people feel like designated sections are hard to understand and we need to spend more time explaining it, then we will. And so let's keep going, and then I want to do enough background that people can say, this doesn't make any sense, and we'll spend more time there.
Okay.
But without a doubt, this is a place where there's very active participation with the TC, and I feel like lately we've been making a lot of progress, and I put a link up to the designated sections Etherpad. So once you understand that we're talking about code that is, some of it's designated, some of it's vendor replaceable, the question becomes, well, how do we know that it's actually working code? How do we know that it interoperates with other OpenStack clouds? And we made the decision in this process to not try to pick parts of the project to say these are core or not core. What we did was we went back to the tests. And this next section of the principles goes through the idea that we're going to use tests to define the code, to define what is core. We're going to identify, so we have a lot of tests. We actually have a lot of tests. I think people will find as we think about it that we don't have enough tests. I don't think we'll ever have enough tests. but we're going to take the tests that we have and we're going to say some of them are required, must pass, and if you pass those must pass tests, then you can say that you are OpenStack. So, and we're not planning to create a police state with a whole bunch of certification bodies. It's a self-certifying activity. If you pass the Tempest tests that we've said are required, then you can say that you are an OpenStack cloud implementation product, whatever. And that's the gist of the core principles. And that was what we did in the last cycle. So leading up to the Hong Kong summit. Since the Hong Kong summit, we've been incredibly busy actually putting those principles into place. So Troy did a really good first pass on these 1,200 plus Tempest tests, turning them into subgroups that we call capabilities. And then we took those capabilities and actually started scoring them to say, is this capability? It was too hard to do all the tests, so we trimmed it down to about 70 capabilities. And there's a capabilities matrix, which is one of the things that we want to get to talking about. And from those capabilities, we needed to score them. And we made the decision that we were going to use a 100-point scale that we may or may not weight. It's a 100-point scale, so some to be determined cutoff line. We will say these capabilities are must pass capabilities, and these ones aren't. So instead of breaking it down by project, this is usually one of the big things people need to understand, is we actually have it by capabilities. So Nova is not all in, or it's partially in, right? There are parts of Nova that we consider must pass capabilities that are core, and there are some features in Nova that are still new enough, or not widely adopted enough, or experimental enough that they aren't required. So do you have to have cells to be an OpenStack cloud? That's a very real question, right? Nova, everybody agrees, is a core project, right? It's been defined that way, but yet not every capability in Nova is a required capability, and if you don't implement that, you should still be able to be OpenStack. And so if you look at these capabilities, and at some point we should bring up the capabilities matrix. I have it somewhere.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up, actually.
Here's the link to it.
Oh, thank you.
If you look at the capabilities matrix, you'll see we have tons and tons of these capabilities, and we've tried to score them into ones that we feel like are must pass and not, and we've tried to identify ones that are on the bubble. And so the next challenge that DefCore faced is, how do you actually pick which things are or not? And what we wanted to do is make that a more quantitative discussion, not a qualitative discussion. So we found that when the community gets into a conversation about two people with a view about something, if they'll stand in the room and argue about it all day long, which is expected behavior. So what we want to be able to do is give us a yardstick. And we spent actually a fair bit of time working through selection criteria for each capability. So we came up with 13 of these capabilities. Now you can see why there's a lot of information. And I have a blog post about the actual capabilities. I think it's linked off of this document. But every one of these, and if you hover over the capabilities, you'll see the definitions. Every one of these criteria is given a yes or no weight. Sometimes if we're indecisive, we give it a half. And then we add up those 13 capabilities and we come up with a score. And what we found is, that gives us 1,000 decisions to make to do this scoring, but it's detailed enough that people can feel like there's some rationale for the decision, and specific enough that if you disagree with one or two things, then that usually doesn't make or break whether or not a capability's in. And so through this process over the last couple months, we've actually come up with a pretty coherent list of capabilities that are clearly must pass, must have capabilities, and clearly not. And that brings us to pretty much the critical moment that we're expecting to happen at the Atlanta Summit, which is we're gonna post a list that says these capabilities are required, which is probably going to be about a quarter or a third of them total, and these aren't. And people are actually going to be able to look at that list and say, this capability that I rely on isn't required. And that's going to have some fallout, right? It's going to have some impacts. And there's whole components in OpenStack that don't have sufficient test coverage, especially since we're talking about Havana right now, that don't have sufficient test coverage to be considered as must-pass capabilities just because they're missing tests. Most of heat is in that category. A lot of the new aspects of Neutron, a lot of new aspects of Keystone. There's whole projects in here that really don't have test coverage representation to be considered must-pass. And so there'll be impacts from that. Whew.
Can we take a breath there?
Please.
So, what do you guys think? Anger, dismay, horror?
Interoperability is super important. It's
Yeah.
a good thing.
Yep.
I think you should compare it to compare what features that application employers actually use for OpenStack. Like, I don't know how we're going to
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I'm not sure if you heard that, and maybe that's be a better question. Well, it's a good question. So Aaron's asking, how do we come up with the rankings? And then maybe a follow-up question would be that, how are we going to come up with rankings in the future?
That's an excellent question. And so there's a couple of caveats with that. Right now, we don't have any cutoffs. What we're doing is we're doing it. There's a score distribution matrix, and if you click over on the score distribution matrix side, you'll see that there's actually a pretty clear yes, no, and maybe set of categories. So for the cutoff, just looking at the histogram is pretty obvious. Are you looking at that score distribution histogram?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So if you look at 75, there's pretty clearly a big block of tests that are above 75, and there's a big block behind it. So the goal here is not to be arbitrary, but to actually look at a histogram like this and see if we can say, when we pick this as a cutoff, it makes it pretty clear that there's scores. The thing that we haven't done and that we probably won't do this pass, but could do, is change the weighting for these individual columns. So
yeah, I think that was more to Aaron's question.
Okay.
Is that correct, Aaron? So the weighting is done by at the top.
Exactly.
And if you.
Yeah, and I think right now, we've kept all the weighting consistent, mostly because we're still trying to get a view of what the data tells us and whether it's useful or not. And so I think what you're seeing is still very much a work in progress. It sets up the framework for the decision-making process, but playing with those weights and understanding them and making sure we have clear, quite honestly, clear understanding of the unintended consequences as much as the intended ones. Yeah. When you start playing around with this data. So we've kept it very simple up front where everything's weighted the same. We're using some fairly straightforward cutoff mechanisms, but I think that's going to do a good job of sort of weeding out the obvious things that don't make the cut and the things that obviously are above the cut. And then I think we're going to have to spend our time really looking at those middle ground cases and understanding, how to make the matrix, work for that. I think the other out that we've left ourselves as a board is realizing that we're not going to be beholden to the spreadsheet exclusively. Meaning that even if we come up with something that hits the score mark, but everybody looks at it and it doesn't pass the sniff test as the right thing for core, we have the right as a board to not choose that. So there's a lot of things, a lot of work to do between now and when we get there. And I think that's where we really want to start getting more people inputting to this. And I know Rob will cover this, but there's a whole set of mechanisms where people can begin to run these tests and solicit feedback and start to voice where this is working and where it's not, so that there's not a handful of us, on a Google Doc working all this out.
Right. And that's, the crowdsourcing aspect's an important part, and I do want to get to that in a minute. The other thing that's important is we're going to iterate. So, we're doing Havana first because it's sort of old news, and then we're going to get reactions from that. We're going to do Icehouse hopefully 90 days later, so mid-release. Hopefully at the Juno Summit, at the Juno release in Paris, we'll actually have the Juno scores simultaneous with the release. So we're giving people time to sort of go through and figure this out. We also want to err on the side of not requiring tests, right? We think it's going to be much harder to remove a must-pass test than it is to add. So we want to, if that makes sense. A lot of times you'll hear us describe this as a smaller core is preferable.
And I think a lot of what we want to try to do is make sure that it's more important to make sure that core is stable and dependable over a period of time. Meaning we don't want to put something in and saying, okay, you can depend on this to be there in OpenStack for the next 6 months, and then it's all going to change 6 months from now. The goal is to, we'd rather have a smaller set of capability in the first pass, but know that capability is going to last for a very long time and something that people can write to and code to and plan on, than we would to have a comprehensive set that has a high degree of fluctuation release to release. And I think that's one of the things we've all agreed to early on. And it may mean in the early stage we miss the mark in terms of providing the kind of breadth of compatibility that people want. But hopefully we also don't get into this point of like, oh, which version? Oh, well, that was core, one version ago, but it's not core this version, and it becomes more of something that we build on over time and have more consistency around. And as a principle, I think we all agree on that. I think how that gets applied in some of the selection will be an interesting thing for us to look for in the next few months.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Did that sufficiently answer your question? You understand the count is the number of tests, and the criteria weight is nothing more than that row.
Yeah, right now it's a simple.
By the value
for the most
above
part,
it,
it's a simple on-off.
So
Either it's a yes/no answer in most cases. The 0.5s are kind of further discussion needed or unclear, but again, that was our pass to get through and sort of get the easy ones out, the zeros and ones that we knew either yes or no to. And I think eventually we'd like to have most of these zeros and ones. The 0.5s were really ones where, for instance, on the TC future direction, we really wanted the TC to weigh in on the strategic importance of those, and we didn't always know that we had the answer there. So those were kind of left as holding places for us to come back to. But it's a pretty simple, there's a lot of information in the graph, but there's not a lot of complex computation behind it right now. It's every column's weighted equally. I guess there's 1 7 up there versus all 8s, but it's basically weighted equally across, and it's either a yes or no in each box, and that's just added up to give us the ranking.
Right. And one of the things, if you scroll down to the bottom of this chart, I actually threw in a percentage. Those percentages might not make sense on the surface. What they are is, it's the percentage of ones and zeros. So it's an indication of how effectively we're scoring these things. So I wanted to try and see, is there a column that we always give a 1 to or always give a 0 to? So ideally, every column would be 50%, and we'd be saying yes to half and no to half. And for the most part, these tests show, these groupings show that we're actually having a lot of diversity in scoring, which you can sort of see visually when you look at the grid. And the challenge with weighting, changing the weights, is that for anything we make more important, we have to make something less important. And we might need to do that, but somebody like suggested, Dell, maybe we don't need docked to be as important, but if we make it, score it down, then it's going to discourage community behavior. This is one of the unintended consequences. There's components in these criteria that are drive community behavior, like documentation or discoverable APIs or things like that. So we don't want things, we want to use these criteria to encourage behavior. Right? It's part of the whole goal. Actually, and that actually is part of our overall principles too. Help drive what we think is, as a board, sustainable behaviors for the community. Right, upstreaming code because that's part of the designated sections, or writing more tests. Right, we hope that this whole process encourages the ecosystem, vendors and customers and people who want to rely on OpenStack to write tests to protect their interests.
So, you want to move back to your list?
I'd love to cover if there's more questions. What I'm thinking would make sense is we've covered all of the core process pieces. There's some more implementation details in collecting the data and posting the data and things like that. But I would rather sort of walk through the process questions before we get to that. If there are some. If not, I'll keep going.
Does anybody have any questions about maybe a... Well,
how about a capability that somebody thinks should be in, and we can say yes or no based on the preliminary screen?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Well, I can play devil's advocate and throw a bone to Mark. So we were talking about this yesterday. So Nova Network as core now, or as opposed to the near future when parts of Neutron start replacing Nova Network. What's your opinion on how that should go?
So I think a little bit of my opinion is that the API is a proxy right now today anyway.
Right.
So when you talk about designated sections, you have an API compatibility, which gives you portability across the clouds, and
right.
potentially implementation of Nova or Neutron, and we provide mostly compatible for a lot of the items that are actually on this list of journey already. So that's one way we can give a consistent core, kind of touching a little bit earlier, we give a consistent, I guess, view of what core looks like over several cycles. Because it's that these
Right. Did you?
So if I heard the point correctly, it was looking particularly at some of the Nova APIs where you've got proxies for services that maybe used to be in Nova and are gradually being broken out, and sort of how those get treated with the idea of a long-lasting core. And I think that's a great point where we've had a lot of discussion. Certainly, as I've looked at these and we've talked through them, that's been one of the areas. In fact, it's one of the drivers around the TC future direction aspect in particular was, things that exist now that may be widely used but are clearly directionally going to be replaced by other services. I was sitting down, I was trying to remember, I know the last discussion we had a really interesting example where we were going through, for instance, some of the images capabilities. Well, I'll even talk about networks in particular, where we look at something like floating IPs, or where you say, okay, well, floating IPs clearly has a longer-term direction as being part of the Neutron API. It's widely used and widely deployed, and this is one of the ones we wrestle with. That the right answer probably is that core is eventually floating IPs through Neutron. But you look at something like the virtual interfaces extension on Nova, and say, well, you could get virtual interfaces, again through Neutron because it's got the network information, but doesn't it actually make sense to be able to get the interface information on a server through the server's API? And that might be an example where it's arguably a proxy function, but in the context of servers still may make sense to be part of the server environment over the long haul. And with similar issues that we've looked at with things like compute volume, I think our leaning at this point is that the base compute volume, which is really just an attached detached function, really ought to be serviceable through the Nova API. And so proxying that function might make sense as core, but having all the other proxies about actually creating volumes and getting a full list of available, there's a whole set of sort of things that are in the Cinder API that really don't make sense to make part of core in the context of Nova. And so that's where, and we even made a decision in that context to sort of split up I had originally proposed at one point that compute volume was just a capability, but we've actually kind of split out compute volume and compute volume proxy as two separate ones, so that we might be able to say that the base attach capability is something you want in Nova as part of the core, but these other things really shouldn't be part of the core. And so I don't know that we have answers to all those yet. I think particularly networks where Neutron's been a little slower to mature than we had all hoped is going to be a tougher one, because there is so much use of that. But I tend to believe that we need to stick to this idea that core needs to be stable, and those network APIs that we really don't think are going to last more than 6 months to a year inside of the Nova context probably shouldn't be core, even if that leaves core a little lighter than we'd like it to be. I tend to favor that, but I don't know if Sean and Rob have opinions as other board members. I know there's a variety of opinions on that around the group, and would love to get solicitation from outside of our own group, as to what the right answer is. But that's more my personal leaning is at this point.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma, because I think our goal is interoperability over time, and this is, we're trying to drive towards interoperability. And so I think Troy's been doing an amazing job with the capabilities and being a great proxy for use, which is one of the hardest things for us to determine. And it's really important that we don't start creating expectations that OpenStack Cloud has a capability that we're expecting to be phased out. But the consequence is that then that slows interoperability, because at that point there's fewer things people can count on. So we're going as fast. We only can go so fast. If we go too fast with this, we can put ourselves in the box, which I think it has negative consequences.
Yeah.
I'm interested in hear from the room if that's how that sounds and if it makes sense.
Yeah, because having a longer term core would also imply a longer definition.
What do you mean by longer
So
term
if you
core?
have something that's a core, and then technical direction project decides that certain capabilities no longer relevant, or there's a place to keep it a core, it's going to get work for certain projects that in terms of one cycle, and then you also have to agree on when does this need core.
Right.
Because in theory, you could have C and say, yeah, we can agree that this should go away, and then that you should still have it. So,
So they feel like they have to support both. So I'm not sure if you guys are able to hear that. So Mark was thinking through of if we include too many things in core, then it's going to make it harder on distributions having to support those for longer periods, and it's going to draw out adding features to replace and deprecate those old features that are already in core.
I totally agree with that. One of the things to remember is that this pass is supposed to find the minimum set, the smallest part of the Venn diagram, and there's likely to be specialized marks for different ecosystem or different uses of OpenStack. So like to ensure public cloud interoperability, there might be a broader set of tests that add onto the core list, or for private cloud there might be things. But we're not there, right? That's a superset.
Yep. And there hasn't been a decision on exactly what these tests would end up, which mark these tests would actually be attached to. Would it be called? How would it be marketed? We're somewhat leaving that up to the foundation employees. That's really their responsibility.
That's true.
We're trying to come up with what we think is a good baseline to start from, and then how we branch off from that. They'll come up with, like they have in the recent past, of how to tweak the brand.
But
the mark is attached to the brand.
I do expect it'll help answer the question of what parts of Nova do I have to ship. Right now it's 100% of Nova, and there's things in it's still not clear what that means. I'm hoping this will give a lot more clarity, because we'll say, all right, if you pass these tests, then this is what you're expecting.
Right. Well, and the point can't be made too often that this is only attached to the brand of being able to carry the mark, the OpenStack mark that this gets attached to. It doesn't mean that you can't actually still deploy and use OpenStack however you want. It just means if you don't pass the test, you won't be able to use the mark.
Right.
That's the only thing it means.
It should be the goal is to make it very clear in the end.
Yeah.
In that case, you guys are like come down and like, hey, you're not OpenStack certified, you can't play OpenStack. Because for instance, the one issue I see is like, say I'm an application deployer and I don't really care about like loading activities or anything like that. Like all my logic is just like self-contained to the image. Like I just want to prove the I guess like the foundation or step in.
Well, that would go to like there's 5 marks now, right? There was some recent clarification on what those marks mean and how what would be the requirements to be able to use the marks. And it's very likely that if I only, like today, if I only wanted to support APIs, and I really didn't want to run Nova or Swift, but I felt it necessary to support the OpenStack APIs, then I wouldn't be able to call myself OpenStack Cloud, but I would be able to call myself not powered by OpenStack, but I guess it is powered by OpenStack. I guess is the mark name now for API support. Is that correct? I'm misstating it. So there'll be certain marks for certain larger set of capabilities. Right now, it's around API support, Swift, and Nova, and
there's a powered by. There's a couple of different marks, and they're actually are in pretty constant flux. I wouldn't say that. That's maybe too broad a statement, but it feels like it because there's times when we have like hardware marks. There's since people are inventing new ways to use OpenStack, where the foundation responds to that.
Sure, which is good. So there's 5 marks today: Nova mark, Swift mark, API mark. I'm using all the above mark, which is OpenStack Cloud, and then there's the public cloud mark. There's
also a works with OpenStack or something like that mark that they're working on.
Yeah, that's the API only mark, basically meant for appliance vendors. Somebody's their appliance would interoperate with, but it could be used for other things as well. So it's very likely. I can't guarantee it, but it's very likely that we'll have something like that in the future. It would just be tests behind the being able to use the marks, rather than just saying, I use Nova, which really doesn't mean much to anybody unless you say what Nova is, define Nova. This will be getting to the point where we start defining, if we do have a Nova mark in the future, then it would be to say that I use Nova, well, here's the test to validate that you're actually using Nova. You're using some of the code and you pass these core Nova capabilities.
Ultimately, that would drive to interop. That the capabilities that are must pass are ones that are necessary to interop. Yep.
I mean, this is to protect the brand, but really what we're trying to do is to promote interoperability.
I guess it would be like a site, all the designers.
Yes.
Like people can just claim whatever they want to claim. Those people who can, but that's no enforcement.
Well, that's actually jumping to one of the points that our intention, where we kind of started off with, is we started off with, well, we should have a place that that anybody that wants to interoperate or use OpenStack can go to. And Josh came up with the idea of Roughstack. So the idea of Roughstack would be that, and it's evolved to the point where we're talking about using Docker agents that would be self-contained and that you could run privately or publicly, and the results could be validated in some way, certified as being good. And the information from running that agent would be pushed up to Roughstack, and that would be the place where everyone can go to say, either put their flag up or to check somebody else's flag. I'm good, or oh, I didn't pass everything, but I passed them once, or I support Swift, or I support whatever your kind of fame is. And there'll be an element of gamification to it. People saying, I passed all the tests, woohoo, I'm better than everyone else. But mostly what it's for is that as customers get involved and vendors want to participate and interoperate with each other, they know there's a neutral place to go to find information. So,
I think it's a good time.
yeah, rather than somebody to say, I use Nova. It's like, well, is that a spaceship or a...
And this is an important part of the quantitative results. What we really want to do is have people identify, community people who actually are using the cloud, identify capabilities that they rely on and say, I rely on this. And the tests are a proxy to that. We're assuming that somebody who doesn't use Heat won't necessarily install it and try and pass the tests, although they might very well install and pass the tests. So we have both hey, we want to see your test results and have you share them. And we want to allow people to do it just like the user committee has some, can respect people's privacy about the results. We want to have people be able to share their results or not. It's up to them. And there's companies that are going to want to be able to have certified results or not, right? Because you could run these tests against Rackspace's cloud or HP's cloud or DreamHost cloud and post the results and say, this is my results for Rackspace, and they might disagree with those results. So part of what we have to do is we have to create a way that results can be allowed to be official, but yet we can also collect a very broad swath of results, test results, and be able to compare them. And then on top of that, allow people to say, I passed these tests, but they don't matter to me. And from that, over time, we're going to be able to groom community feedback about which capabilities should be in or not. That doesn't mean they are automatically, but it's usually a good indication of where we want attention to go. This is... Go ahead.
I was going to say, earlier you were talking about one of your points was like one of the requirements could potentially be that they're running some piece of existing OpenStack code. How do you plan on validating that type of attack?
I love that question. I don't. So there's an element of honor system in a lot of what we're trying to do. The goal here is to encourage upstreaming, and if somebody is selling an OpenStack product or running an OpenStack cloud and can pass all the tests, but they're choosing to not play the game and use OpenStack code or share the OpenStack code that is designated, if they've changed it. Right now we don't want to create a police state. If it becomes really a challenge, the market I suspect the market will adjust sufficiently with people who don't want to do that. So we're waiting. We're taking a wait and see attitude about that.
And there'll be a certain amount of weight of support to long term make that work for any company. I mean, you could probably do that for a release or two without causing too much pain, but that becomes very difficult to keep a fork essentially up to date and passing these tests as the tests keep maturing and it's going to be very hard. So I think just the weight of trying to do something like that, I'm sure there probably will be some companies that will dabble with certain aspects of that. But I think just the weight of doing that will likely force more and more companies to adopt more and more of the community code rather than trying to maintain their own forks.
Yeah. There are active discussions around what happens if somebody rewrites OpenStack in Java, say, and passes all the tests, but it's not upstream OpenStack. Those are very real issues that we're going to have to face, and in some ways we're facilitating those conversations in the future by the actions that we're taking. It's, to me, if the community is not strong enough to deal with those things or embrace potentially an API compatible alternative, then I think that we're not building something as strong as we think we are.
Well, I think the other piece of that is, the thing we need to get right first is to make sure that people who are using OpenStack at least are interoperable and have some consistency around it. And while it's easy to sort of think about all the worst case scenarios of things that could go happen around the edges, I think we all feel the pain of probably being slow to move to just get the basics done around the stuff that matters that we're all working on and even working on together in good faith, and just need some common direction on. So I think getting to a lot of this low-hanging fruit is a great first step for us, and I look forward to the day when our biggest problem is what to do because somebody rewrote OpenStack in Java, and that'll be a good place to be from where we are now as well.
Yeah. And enforcing somebody not upstream.
I want to make sure we got the question from Craig that came up on the chat around are requirements to a release? Seems like you have to, and what does that mean for someone who's Icehouse interoperable and not Juno's, or a grace period? So, Rob, that probably gets. We haven't talked a lot about the process, I guess, outside of how we got to this first pass, but clearly the goal is to have an identified core associated with each release, integrated release of the product stack. And as Rob said, we started with Havana. We hope to actually catch up to Icehouse within about 90 days after the summit, and then hopefully by the time Juno comes out and we hit the summit in Paris, we've caught up and have a defined core that's applicable to Juno. And from that point, then we hope that we're staying consistent, where there's a 6-month update to core coincident with the 6-month integrated release processes. I think obviously we recognize there's a grace period involved in this process. I don't know that we've necessarily laid down the law for what that looks like in the long run, but in the short term, we clearly what we're coming out with in Atlanta that is Havana based is considered to just be an example, if you will. There's going to be no enforcement based on, suddenly if we drop something on, in mid-May and says this is the test, and, it includes floating IPs, and Rackspace still doesn't have floating IPs up, we're not going to say, okay, Rackspace, you can't use the OpenStack brand until you get floating IPs. What we're hoping to do is sort of say, look, we've got about a 6-month lag, certainly. So we don't expect to have, I think, any enforcement around this until, the Paris summit window at a minimum. And some of this will depend on the feedback that we get and the progress that people make. I think if we define a core that causes 75% of OpenStack, vendors to have to drop the brand the first day we do enforcement, we've broken the process. I mean, it's really not the goal that we have. So I think at a minimum, we're kind of looking at having some enforcement beginning towards the end of the year. Exactly how that lines up with I doubt it will line up directly with the Havana version, just because I think Havana is our first draft and is likely to be full of holes. It may be some modification between, Havana. I doubt we'll also come out and say, okay, everything that's new in Juno that just released, we're also enforcing on day one either. I don't know, Rob, you probably talked even more about this than I have in some of the discussions. I'd love for you to add your thoughts around that, but grace period, definitely. Exactly how long and how binding, I think those are some things we have to sort out.
I think that what we've done so far has been considered a cool science project. I hate to say it, but until we actually come up with a list of yes and no's, I think a lot of people, especially the commercial interests around OpenStack, are not paying that close attention. So I look at our Havana list as sort of this first test where people are going to be able to benchmark against it, and we're going to get a new level of dialogue around this whole process after people start measuring their product or their service against this list. And so we expect there to be a lot of pushback. We expect there to be, I don't know about pushback. I think there's going to be a lot of more discussion, an elevated sense of what's going to happen, which is why we've been so careful to be quantitative in our analysis, because it becomes very hard if a vendor walks up and says, this one feature is required, I need it to be in business, and we need to go back and point to how we made that decision. But I expect we're going to spend a lot of time in the next cycle having that conversation with vendors, and that's exactly where we want to be. This is the warning shot, if you will.
Well, and one of the points that we can't make too much is that just because one feature is really important to a vendor and it's not part of core, doesn't mean that now they can't carry the brand. Right. It just means that if their entire product only uses that feature, then likely they can't carry the brand. But if they carry all the required core features plus that feature that's not in core, they're fine. They can still carry the mark.
The more dangerous, the more impactful for vendors are going to be if they're replacing parts of the code that are considered designated, or if they have capabilities that they can't implement that are must-pass capabilities. So if they picked, let me find one off the list that's high. No, I don't want to use that one as an example. Compute key pairs is it's on our compute instance actions. These are ones that are their score closer to the bottom of the list, and there might be people who don't have them, didn't want to implement them for whatever reason. They're going to find that they need to include that capability in the product to be considered use the OpenStack brand. So by having a smaller core, we're greatly reducing the risk of that happening. But there almost certainly are going to be people out there who didn't implement that feature or can't pass the test on that feature, and are going to have to do some corrective action or give up the brand.
Or testing general setup.
I'm sorry, say that again.
So for testing, we're actually going to capture in general what the setup is. So like KVMs in, if they're using these on the packet. Just kind of.
I don't believe so. No.
Okay.
Can you repeat that?
Are we going to capture their the infrastructure configuration? And since we're running Tempest,
that's a great. So this is a really interesting thing about the potential for stress on Tempest. Tempest has some tests that are not just binary API capability tests, but are more qualitative. And there's some black box and some white box tests. What I'm expecting will happen is we're going to start seeing people bring in tests that they think are important to pass, even if they're not must-pass tests, on the expectation that we can start identifying the tests for that or for other potential marks. And I think that would be a great thing to be able to have in the suite. They might So for example, a Hyper-V compatibility set of tests, which I think would be tremendously beneficial to the community, might and only work on clouds that enabled Hyper-V, might never become must-pass tests, but they would be incredibly valued at having this in the test suite, and we're making the test suite more valuable and more generally used. Right? The teacup Roughstack, and we haven't talked about teacup yet, but the idea of crowdsourcing test results and having them reported means that, I'll use the Hyper-V example. So let's say the Hyper-V team writes a set of tests that only pass if you use Hyper-V. They're never going to pass gate, right? But they're valuable tests for the community of users who are invested in the Hyper-V capability. And by including them in the crowdsourced data collection, we could actually start getting real data on how many clouds out there are passing the Hyper-V test suite. And that would allow us to make much more informed decisions about the community in general. So we're driving this process to get the must-pass data, but it can have much more profound impacts about data collection of what capabilities, down to specific choices of plugins, are important in the community. And to me, that's actually one of the huge benefits to doing this. It's one of the things we're trying to drive the behavior.
To add on to that, one of the really important things to add to your question about not only there would be information based.
Oops, I lost the sound.
Likely be feature specific. but you wouldn't necessarily know the size of the cluster or region it was from or things like that. But that kind of information, that may not be exactly what you're thinking about, but that kind of information likely will be tied together as we start developing marketplaces for public providers and service providers, like we have the training, as that starts expanding into other areas of OpenStack companies, affiliated companies. Then it's not building it myself, but I think it's highly likely that that will link back to the Roughstack capabilities of that public cloud or of that service provider. So then the companies in the marketplace very likely will talk about their capabilities in broad sense of regions and size of clusters and things like that, because that would be important for customers and interoperability. And then the actual details of what their real test capabilities are would then be exposed through Roughstack. So you should get a full picture in that way as that stuff builds out. They're being done in parallel right now.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's kind of, I guess, what I was going to add a little bit is cluster sizing is nice, but in terms of asking someone asking the language underlying infrastructures, at least in general, of some of the questions you find on the user survey, I think it's helpful even for feeding back into the direction of here the clouds are passing, here the clouds are passing at this level, they're going to make
right.
And making sure that usually that's hypervisors, and just making sure that we're creating by production data or production data for folks certifying with the test.
There'll be real survey data.
Even if it's not automatically discoverable as much as when they post the results, they can do it in aggregate saying, I use KVM, this is my backend, whatever. And they don't need releases as much as general buckets.
Definitely. Yeah, so what I heard was you were talking about the benefits of having a broader data collection, even down to covering some of the things the user committee does, and very much we've been talking to the user committee a bit, and we're hoping that some of the data we start collecting automatically with Roughstack can lessen the burden of the user committee for what they're trying to test. They can actually switch to because they only have a limited amount of attention that they collect. So if they spend a lot of their time collecting what did you install, then there's other quantitative and qualitative things they don't get to cover. And so we're hoping to be able to lessen their data collection burden and free them up from that a little bit. There was some talk a while ago about actually embedding data collection into OpenStack, which most people didn't like very much. And we're actually accomplishing that, but in a much more voluntary way. And that brings up the Rally project and Roughstack a little bit. I wanted to add something to what Sean was saying about Roughstack. So Roughstack, the idea with Roughstack is there's like, I've talked to 10 companies that have all implemented the same thing. Roughstack is really a place for you to collect your Tempest results and show them in a UI so that you can compare sort of installation to installation how you're doing. A lot of people have implemented this in a lot of different ways, and we're actually making a community portal. There'll be a community portal version that's maintained by OpenStack, but you could run the same code internally if you just wanted to QA your OpenStack cloud and collect the results yourself, and then post the data back up to Roughstack and share it. If you're tracking the Rally project, it has a relatively similar goal. It's using Tempest as a way to do continuous delivery and performance benchmarks. So we're working with them to have some synergy around those things. We have slightly different objectives. And then there's this other concept called Teacup, which is Tempest running in a Docker container. And so the idea is we want to lessen or eliminate the burden to set up Tempest to do a test of your own cloud. So the idea of Teacup is that anybody can test their own cloud and then upload and share the results, even if they've never set up Tempest, even if they're not the site admin. They can just create the container, use their credentials, point it at their cloud, and then share, if they want to, share the data back to Roughstack. So we're really trying to cast an incredibly broad net to collect this data back. And Roughstack will also one of the things that Piston, who's one of the sponsors of Roughstack, with Josh McKinty, has really been focused on maintaining the ability to do routine scan, routine probe, and report the results back. The board is still looking at making sure that we don't become a certification body in doing this. That's not our goal yet, and so we're not trying to expose people for whether or not they pass Tempest 100% or not. I think we're going to get to a point with some of these specialized tests that you can't pass Tempest 100%, which is fine. That's reasonable.
Yeah, like a Hyper-V test, or you need to run a hypervisor, but which hypervisor or hypervisors you support, that's more of an interoperability question.
Right.
There may be some vendors that find it necessary to support all available hypervisors, and that's a benefit that customers are looking for. So,
exactly. Great question.
So we have about 10 minutes left. Is there anything else you wanted to cover, Robert, Troy?
I was hoping to throw it back to say, what do we focus on when we explain this, right? We're not going to have an hour of most people's time to explain what's important. What after hearing it for an hour did people think we should focus? What's the important point?
Should we have started by talking about how we actually implement the tests and the capabilities rather than going into the history so much?
Yeah, I think the 10-step was a good idea. Because I think the message is a lot tighter than say it was last.
That's not saying a whole lot, but thank you for that.
No, it really is. It's a lot more packages, less. It's a lot easier to adopt.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad you're saying that though.
Yes.
Because we've talked about this quite a bit since then, so that's great.
Yeah, I think from introducing folks, I think that's a good start. I think the capabilities make sense. I think just having this is kind of where we decided
for the capabilities.
Yeah, the capabilities
okay.
Are kind of. I think it's good. We've kind of framed it as like this is. I think the statement was made and maybe emphasized a little bit. Kind of give a better presentation in terms of timelines. You want that small. You want the smallest intersection of the Venn diagram starting out. So then you immediately are supposed to understand why things come out versus why pushing into things. And then just including one or two examples of like off the I mean, it's got a score of 15, but obviously it doesn't. It's something for future consideration.
Right.
But I do think a lot of this does help to slow this down, and it makes the conversation a lot more focused. Because it seems to me that a lot more of the points of contention now are designated sections, Z-direction, but that those for the first pass is more of a, hey, you really want to dive into our conversation. What is a designated section? This is setting up a good basic framework that it's
Okay. Did you guys get most of that?
I've got some notes. The last part was breaking up a little bit. So it sounds like one of the things we need is a graphic, and it sounds like we also need to make the capabilities easier to understand quickly. Is that a fair?
Yeah. Not to oversimplify what Mark was just saying, but giving an example and walking it all the way through, so that they understand how. From the Venn diagram all the way to the capability, why something would be in or out, rather than talking about it abstractly.
Okay.
The overall, it would help to explain it much more succinctly.
Or just like, you have so we decided legacy was a one instead of just take a single row out of this and turn that into a slide and say, if you want to break down this capability, this is kind of, we looked at A, B, C, D. And then
so you can just focus on that.
You can focus on that and point people, if they want to go through the whole matrix, hey, here's the link, you can go dive in and send this question.
That's a very good point. Do you get that?
Yeah.
Just pull one row out of the row and header out of the capability scoring matrix, and just use that as an example so that it's not number jumble as much.
I like that a lot. That makes sense. I was thinking that it would help to sort the capabilities from 100 down. Would that also help? Right now we're learning functional groups.
I think that would be helpful. I think it'd be nice to see that too.
Because it shows what's important. The functional groups are the ones who just take that with it out. You can get the score from high to low groups.
So general agreement on high to low. So Aaron would like to see it within functional groups, score to high to low.
Oh. I like that. Okay.
I would like to also see rainbows in this.
And unicorns?
I think it would be cool, like, when explaining it, just for, like, application lawyers who might not be familiar with all these extensions here, like, walk through, like, sample type application, like, say, for instance, you want to have variable images, or variable, like, instant sizes, so, like, that's something that a lot of people want, so that's, like, a core thing, just, like, as far as, like, when it's being explained, I think, like, maybe an application, like, what features do they actually rely on? Like, what are the common applications that we can put out of OpenStack, and what actual capabilities do they need from OpenStack? Because for me, like, that's something that I'm always, like, questioning, too, like, do people really need all these additional, like, it's nice, but, like, what are the really most used ones besides just, like, food? Just, like, a survey from that.
Well, that may be a cart before horse. Is that it may be until we actually deploy this, what we think is that beauty's in the eye of the beholder. We think we know what we think we know, but we.
Oh no, the known unknowns are coming out. Donald Rumsfeld.
There you go. I didn't quote it exactly, but yeah. I think we're going to find out once we go through the first couple of months of this that we'll be surprised at some of the results. Because the surveys have been very abstract. They haven't been very specific for good reason, because it's hard to get somebody to take a survey. Well, now we'll have basically a real survey that will be test-driven. And so linking that up with customers and public providers, and we'll start to figure out maybe some of the things that we thought were really important, not so much, because nobody's using it.
One of the things I'm curious is, like, key pairs, how that could be a deep 5. I've heard that should be definitely 100. How could one?
I think.
So, like, you prefer to deploy, like, you have an image that's based on passwords that you're, like, putting in an environment. Anything.
Are you talking about one of the capabilities specifically?
Yeah, why is compute key pairs, as an example, why is it not 100%? Why did Foundation for Others and Cluster score 0?
This is where the fun gets in. It has to do with what Foundation for Others is one of our favorite. We call this the Mark Shuttleworth test. Actually, it's in his honor. Mark, one of the things that Mark really asked when we started this cycle was, are things that you can build on top of an OpenStack cloud? What are the things that you could build if you already had an OpenStack cloud, and what are things that you just can't do unless you have an OpenStack cloud? You have to have, they're sort of fundamental. And so we use that as a test. If there's a way to compose it out of other OpenStack parts, then it gets a 0. And so the idea was that storing key pairs is something you could do without it being a native capability. And then cluster is a interesting one where there's a benefit, there's a positive benefit to being part of a set of tests or a feature set. And so we score things that are integrated with other capabilities with a cluster score, so that we don't have partial function groups implemented. And this one didn't pass either of those tests in discussion.
So actually, that might
Does
be a
that
good
help?
example.
Well, that's why I picked it, because it was on the bubble. So the examples that we'll use should be the ones that are down in the 74, in the 75 range, so that it's not just all yes. They're not, the ones that are all yes aren't that exciting.
Yeah.
Great.
So like fallibility zones and like live migration, I feel like those might not should even be considered because those seem to me like operators like that.
And availability zones is a 77 for that, right, along those lines. Well, the admin ones.
Yeah, we've had an interesting discussion in general around the admin functions, which, obviously there's a set of admin functions that doesn't even really make sense to test if you don't have admin access to the cloud. Like we may use those extensions inside of Rackspace to run the public cloud, but nobody outside of Rackspace would ever be able to validate whether they're there or not. But at the same time, if you're really trying to get commonality around environments where you maybe managing a private cloud, those admin features may be very important. And so we kind of go back and forth on whether admin functions should even be considered as part of core, or whether there should be a separate section if you've got access to administrative privileges or not. And this is one of those areas I think we'd love to give feedback. Do we do it and allow the vendors to publish their full results of what they can get with admin access, or do we rely solely on what you can test externally? All those have been topics that I think we've kind of gone back and forth on as we've thought about them over time, and haven't. That one in particular around the admin functions, I think is still one that even where they score high in the matrix, we're not sure what we really do with that conceptually.
I don't know. Thinking about it, I think the admin stuff is kind of cool too. One of the things I'm curious about is, are you also curious about data of like large internal deployments that aren't like public clouds? Like I guess, would you keep track of that data as well?
Well, that's
like people want to get that of it.
Yeah, so that would be a good question. Like Yahoo, we filled out the survey. We're generally extremely paranoid about giving out exact details of how what our capabilities are in specific regions. We generally talk in broad integers. I'm not exactly sure if I'll be able to get approval to run. I know I can run Teacup, obviously, but be able to publish it, my guess would probably be no. I'd probably say no way. Well, we'd hold on to it, and it'd be important to us, because then we'd know how we stack up to our partners and how close to true OpenStack we are. Hopefully we're close. And I'd actually use it as a tool to go back to my management saying, what the hell, we scored 50, something's seriously wrong here. We're forking, even though we didn't think we are. So I think it'll be a very useful tool. There will be some companies, and maybe I'll be able to convince people that it'll be anonymized enough that I'll be able to publish it, and it will be an element of gamification.
Because I think like one of the cool things is like that top 5 minutes test, and you do something similar like that.
Yeah. It's bragging rights. Well, I used this as an example a little while ago. I went to I've gone to supercomputing for a number of years, and I sat through a talk of Amazon doing a rather good job of it, by the way, physicists on using AWS, which is baffling me, but they're into it. So, but there was a level of participation. But when they got to the point where they talked about they ran a job, we verified, and they came out with a number that they said made their across multiple regions, they could run equivalent to number 13 on top 500. Everyone got excited and started talking, and we got all kinds of feedback. There was no way to verify any of it. It was just a number, and it was just their bragging rights. But it got that element of gamification. Got a lot of people really excited about, holy crap, AWS is real. So that kind of stuff has a lot of power, even though logically, you go look at that and go, well, that doesn't mean anything. It could have been, they could have just made that up. There's no way to verify that, but it's still there. I would assume that probably they went back and used that as a big reason for.
Sorry?
They did really well.
I am, but I'll be done in 5 minutes.
But to make sure that people who are putting out scores and using that marketing collateral, that it's validated.
You want to answer that, Troy? So how are we going
repeat
to
that.
validate? How do we plan on validating the teacup results?
People are using it in marketing and advertising as validation.
Yeah, and I'm sure there will be.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's part of where the
Kyle's
automated
asking the
upload
question, by the way.
process, kind of goes to the tools that we're looking at setting up with the Roughstack piece would run the test, collect the results. Like you don't actually get to just go to the Roughstack site and fill in and say my results were X. Like the idea is you run the tool generates results. You choose whether those get uploaded or not. But I don't know. We haven't gotten to the point of thinking about whether somebody finds a way to hack the results in the middle between the publication and the other. But we've been closer to the tool itself.
So that is something we've discussed a little bit, and this is the fun thing about Teacup. Anybody can use it. So if a vendor fakes their results and uploads them, and their customers use Teacup to validate their results against the same thing, they're going to report discrepancies. This is the amazing thing about open source and crowdsourcing it, is that if somebody's being dishonest with it, they're going to be outliers, and we'll find that. There's no practical way to force everybody who tries to use the results to produce false results. So there is a risk. I expect somebody will, because what Sean's saying about gamification, stakes could be high, and there will certainly be people who try and fudge it. It'll be an interesting part of this whole OpenStack experiment in some ways, right? We're doing new stuff.
So honor system.
Yeah.
At least for now.
I'm all done with that.
And with that, guys, it's getting late for me, so I'm ready to call it a night on this.
We're actually at the end. So thank you, Rob and Troy.
Hey, thank you for having me. Thanks for hosting the event. Awesome.
Hopefully this was helpful, so that the next couple of ones you feel like you got a lot more.
This has been great. I appreciate the comments. I'm doing another one tomorrow in Austin, so we'll see if that one is smoother and how people receive it. So thank you for being guinea pigs, everyone.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Cheers.